We're pleased today to have three speakers, facilitators. I'm not sure exactly what to call you, but they're going to be talking about connections between online learning, educational technology, and lecturing. So it's a bit of an unusual combination here, but I think it'll be interesting. It's meant to be interactive, so it's not just going to be a straight presentation, I don't think. We've got some really special guests here today. I asked if they could introduce themselves, so maybe one of you wants to speak for the three, I'm not sure, but however, if you could introduce yourselves.
Otherwise we can speak for ourselves. My name is Elizabeth Reinhardsson, and I'm very glad to be here. We came, all of us, from a new university in Sweden, in south of Sweden, about 2 hours north from Lund, if everyone knows Lund or Copenhagen. And this university is called Linnaeus University. If anybody knows Linnaeus, made the system of the flowers and so on. So, and we are professors for special education, all of us. So if I may give this one for you, if you ever is in Sweden, you are welcome to Linnaeus University.
Okay, thank you. Welcome too.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to our guest today, and you start.
Rock, paper, scissors, or what?
Yeah.
Well, I think the format was for us each to just talk briefly about what it is that we maybe did in our presentation. I suppose we're supposed to encourage you to come and watch the videos. And I should thank Jay first for selecting me as the Professor of the Year and the $25,000 award that comes with that. I haven't seen the check yet. Jay is presented later.
Well,
it's not true, John.
I have a quick comeback to that, but I decided I'm not going to go with it. So it revolved around, I'm not sure if I've seen the work of the year yet, but I won't.
That's a good comeback.
I won't quite go there.
Actually, I had a good time doing, with Jay's support, the online teaching piece, because I've now had 8 years of working at Bethel in online with cohorts in the doctoral program, educational administration. And we've learned a lot because we started with Bob's help and kind of the seat of our pants and Jay and figured out a lot about online as we went. So hopefully the presentation that I put together is not just a kind of a statement of what's in the literature today, but is sort of practical experience, because I've had to figure out how do you find a student who doesn't show up the first week, and they're online and they're remote and you don't know, you just can't get them the next week in class type thing. So little practical things, as well as the bigger issues, which is how do you really engage people in a distance learning situation? How do you make them feel like you're part of what it is that you're doing in the class? So my experience prior to this was in educational administration as a principal and an assessment director in large school districts. So when I came over here, I brought all my bad habits of middle school lunchroom duty and everything. But I found it works well in online, because in many cases online is kind of a random event, because you've got a lot of people out there and they're all bouncing different ways, and you have to find a way to build something around them, sort of unlike a classroom where you've got them within reach and you can kind of almost walk around them and wrap them up. This is a pretty big wrap to do when, like in our program, and Craig Paulson, who's here as the director of the program, we'll have students in Indonesia, Europe, Texas, New York, all over the world. So it's a little hard to physically go get your arms around them, so you have to kind of figuratively figure out how to do that. It's a good analogy, I think, Craig, for what it's like to work in a middle school.
Yeah, herding cats.
Herding cats is very real. So I would hope that if you had a chance to look at that online presentation, that you would find some practical ideas in there. And then I also have a supplement to it, which is called Getting Into Online. And I try to put together kind of 3 steps that would get you to think about, if you were interested in online, how might you approach it? They kind of go from the global to the very, very specific. Can you sit in front of a computer for 2 hours and pay attention? Because if you can't, you probably don't want to do online, because you're going to have a hard time unless you have ways to compensate for concentration that's broken all the time. So very practical and hopefully very useful, or kind of global also in that. I hope you have a chance to take a look at that. also includes a PowerPoint presentation that's by Scott McLeod, which is basically, it's called Dangerously Irrelevant. And if you haven't seen it, although many of us have, you really do need to watch it because it makes a case for where education is going and are we really going in the direction that we need to be going. So that's just a quick kind of intro to my online presentations.
One of the things that we agreed to do is to try to see where the similarities were between the different approaches that we took. And as I looked at the three models there, the thing that struck me first was the emphasis on engaging students, that there are different ways of engaging students, but it seems to me at least that the use of technology is extraordinarily powerful in doing that. And of course that's one of the things they're trying to do. I had that really brought home to me in a different way, in sort of a non-academic way a few years ago. I have a granddaughter who has ADD, and you know the situation with that. And so as she began to start into school, we were all concerned. In fact, she had a problem when she first got to school because she couldn't sit on her chair. She would keep sliding forward and she'd fall on the floor. And she just was moving all the time, and they were considering getting a chair with a strap around it and all kinds of things. So it was really a matter of concern. And being somewhat interested in the computer technology, I made sure she had a computer at home and began to get some educational games, if you want to call them that, but educational programs. And to our amazement, you said, can you sit in front of the computer for 2 hours? She could, and she did. And we were absolutely surprised that because of what was going on, the interactivity and the fact that she could engage with it, she now, for the first time, could concentrate and went on to become a good student and is in college now, etc. But I could see the technology was capturing her and she could react to it. When I would talk to her about it, she would insist that she was sawing some logs in half, and in fact she was doing mathematics. And she was filling in some blanks and she was learning to write. She turned out to be just an outstanding writer, excellent writer. And so I know that from an early age it can engage students, and we've certainly seen that in the adult program. So I think that what John was doing in his program is kind of engagement on steroids, for sure. The other comment that I think I noticed in it was that starting to use technology, you have to go in steps. When I looked at what John was doing, I thought about the new instructor who would look at that and would be overwhelmed by the depth and the variety and the interaction between various techniques. Whereas in at least what I did for that presentation was a fairly one-off, simple technique of engaging students and providing feedback a lot faster. And so you've got to start where you are and not necessarily be satisfied that you're doing everything you could, but it just shows you where you can go. And that it is a progressive process. It isn't just a one step. It has to build up over time.
Yeah. If you don't know, I teach art history, so my career occurs in the dark. And I'm happy to talk about that, so especially if there's questions. But just for a minute to connect to this technology and this distance education, watching your two presentations and thinking about what I do, coupled to some encouragement we're getting just develop online courses. In the art department, we've been thinking, how do we do that? Can we do that? So your presentations were interesting to me, and I'm trying to picture how I would do that. I don't know if you had time to watch mine. I mean, basically, you know, I have slides up there all the time, and I'm trying to engage students with specific artworks in detail, walking them through that. Even though my classes are in the dark, I can still sort of get my arms around them. I'm having a hard time imagining that being successful from a distance. Part of what engages me as a lecturer is I view a lecture kind of as itself an artwork, with an inciting incident and a development and a kind of a conclusion. I feel almost silly, like would I record that to a pretend audience, and is anyone actually out there? So I mean, those are actually some of my anxieties about, you know, because for me, I feel this really deep connection between myself, the artwork, the artists I'm speaking about, and my students. Now, having said that, I'm doing an interesting experiment now. We have a new curriculum in the department. I'm developing a new survey course, and that's going to free up my upper level courses to be more interactive. And in this process, I've taken one of my best students, Melissa Gwen, who's a senior art history major. She's got into a great grad school for next year. She's very research capable. And I've been having her do focus groups with my students, with me not knowing who they are, to try to ferret out from them how they learn in my courses. With a lot of questions layered in, like, would this thing kind of work that you guys are doing? So that's in process. I don't know quite how it's going to come out. And I don't know if you have particular insights, having watched what I do, how this might work. We were told this is kind of a conversation, so basically I'm trying to mine this to help my teaching.
I'm the last one that can comment on art, but I think that perhaps the use of Photoshop, where you get into layers, you begin to appreciate layers inside of Photoshop, you can unbundle art by its layers, and I would think that by presenting one layer. I remember I had an art teacher in college, and I mean, I ground my way through it because I had to, and I didn't learn anything, I don't think. But he talked about some of the shading of landscapes, and he particularly commented on sort of a dull, misty days, and appreciated the background that was, to me, it looked like a dull day. Okay, and he was all into this wonderful background, and I'm trying to figure out what in the world's so interesting about that. Well, it turned out that later in life, I ended up living in Belgium for a number of years, and if you've been in Belgium, you know that almost every day is a dull, gray day. Well, he came over there, and we saw him over there, and he was so excited because he said, "Oh, look at these beautiful weather conditions. I just love looking at this dull, gray day." Me. Well, I would think that if you were into dull, gray days, you could, you know, in sort of a picture, you could pull out the layer of that layer of it and talk about that, and at least separate it from the other part of the picture. So I think that the ability technology has to take apart pictures into their components might be something that could be pursued.
One response, Wayne, to your question, let's turn a vertical to a horizontal, is my picture of it. In today's market, we often say lecture bad, hybrid or technology good, online wonderful. You know, we've got these values that are becoming in place with where we're going, the future. If you take that hierarchy and actually turn it the way it should be, horizontal, what you were doing, and I watched yours, and I was very impressed with the engagement, with the enthusiasm, with really the core of what you were teaching and the relationship it had with the students as they were listening to that. That is one way to get people to engage in learning. What Bud did with his interactive pieces was engage people in learning. What online does with some of its little tricks of the trade is engage people in learning. So to me, it's just a continuum of which the arrow runs back and forth. The counterpart to what you were doing in that particular art history class would be a video, audio, PowerPoint in an online environment, where I could deliver that in that manner if I wanted to. It's not going to have the same impact as it does with you physically. As I watched you move around the room and engage people, it's not going to have that, so you have to find a way to supplement. But it's not better or worse. It's just a different delivery system, with the key always being, are we engaging the learners somehow? Eric Jensen, who is one of the early writers, but continues to write on brain research, his phrase is very simple: the mind gets bored easily. And if you can't find a way to engage as a teacher, then the art of teaching is probably being lost, and you're into just the mechanics of it. So finding ways to, and you do that as your voice pattern, your movement, the context, the visuals, break things up and engage the learner. And that's a valuable piece. So as I watched it, I try to keep that perspective in mind, because a lot of times we hear people say, well, the hype of technology is the new education. Well, that's not true. It's not technology that's the new education. It's the hype of engaging learners. And now we have more options. So I just see it as options and grabbing hold. So hybrid class is a wonderful thing. Because a hybrid class, you can tie in all kinds of things, and you're still there to do some of the physical stuff. But it's not possible everywhere. Understand that online learning is the fastest growing area of education, 2 to 1 right now, and will continue to probably be in years to come. So we're going to have to figure out how to put it all together, and I think we do quite well. There's a place for all of it. So that was my observation, Wayne, as I looked at it.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the piece you saw was the first day of class. And so this is part of what I'm thinking. I mean, I can imagine a pretty well done, whether it's pre-recorded or streaming, you know, a lecture where I'm guiding them through the images and using my little cursor to point things out. But the demonstration you saw being the first day of class, I was actually doing 2 things there. One, I was teaching them some art history, but I was also figuring out where they are in their visual literacy. And so all the questions I asked them, when I asked them to describe and analyze, it's about engaging, but it's also me being able to gauge what their visual literacy is, because I can't proceed in my lectures until I know what's connecting and what's over their head. And that seems like a highly personal. I don't know how I would do that online exactly.
I don't know. Madeline Hunter, and again, one of the great teacher gurus of time, referred to that as dipsticking.
Yeah, yeah.
Constantly sticking the oil stick in to find out what's going on here, what are they getting, where are they at, what's missing. And I think of that often, even online, as I read a response online. I'll think, well, what's missing here? Because you'll pick up that there's a core piece of knowledge missing because they made an assumption that somebody else has already addressed. Or sometimes they've taken some core knowledge and misinterpreted it. And then other times they've synthesized something that's just plain crazy. And you either want to encourage it, because crazy thought is not all bad, but you want to discourage the creativity. So you can see it in the written word, and you can see it in some of the assignments. I do a lot of reflective writing. So they'll have to reflect on something, and in their reflections I see a lot of that you're doing. Where's this reflection going? Is it self-centered? Is it other-centered? You know, you're looking for these themes. So there are some ways to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to comment just on something John said, and that is that there's this perceived hierarchy that lecture is at the bottom now, and all the fun stuff is up the scale. In fact, Jay, I was really glad that you had that piece in there, because lecture is still valuable, and we can't lose sight of that and just kind of throw it out. But the challenge really, as you're pointing out, is, all right, how can we begin to bring some other techniques into the lecture format? We don't use it here at Bethel, but there is a Blackboard extension add-in called Tegrity. This would be something really exciting for you to look at, because it allows you to do things with drawings on the board, and it's captured as you're doing it digitally, and the students then can play it back and see the build-up. In other words, they don't just see the final picture that's on the blackboard or on the whiteboard, but they can see the components as it's building up. It's being used a great deal in chemistry and some architecture, where you begin to see the construction of something, and then the learner can go back and on their own computers at their own time and follow that again. So I think the challenge is that we need to be sure that lecture is not relegated to the ash bin, but to really take some of the stuff that we're doing and how can we extend that so that the lecture has more value, because I still think that there's a lot of content that does need to be communicated. That's serious content that you can't get away from it just because people don't like it.
Yeah, and that's actually one of my big issues in art history. I mean, students growing up in American public school systems, they do have at least some basis in history and literature and other areas. They're almost completely ignorant in terms of visual literacy and visual history, even though they've spent their whole life being phenomenally visual. And they're actually better at it than they realize, but they don't quite know it's a discipline yet. And so there's so much material, there's so much information they need from simply in terms of what were the social contexts, who were the artists, what were the works, who were the patrons, what are the dynamics of that.
One of the, living in Belgium for a number of years, of course, we saw all the art of Bruegel, and I was fascinated with Bruegel's art because there are so many pictures inside the picture. Yeah. And I could very easily see taking that kind of thing and beginning to unbundle it into the separate pictures to build up, which is the master picture in terms of what he's doing. And I think technology could do that. Yeah.
I know we were interested in your input as well. Any questions or just observations or thoughts or things that anybody wants to toss in the mix? Craig, before you fall asleep back there.
No, I'm wide awake here. This is good. No, sometimes we talk that if you're doing things on a lower level, like knowledge or comprehension or frankly even application, then it's fine to, students need to be able to gather that in through any means, and one means can service all those individuals. But it seems once you go to maybe some other levels, the synthesis or analysis or evaluation levels, it's best to engage them in a style that's more meaningful to them individually. So rather than treating everybody the same, so I think it goes back to what John kind of had, is a variety of pieces of engaging them, because it's okay to put out information and comprehension and so forth in means that engage them, but ultimately they have to make it their own, and having a variety is probably a good idea, and I think you all mentioned different ways of doing that within your current settings. So that was my thought as I was sitting here.
No, I would probably rival you for non-popularity. I teach applied statistics, research and statistics.
Yay! No.
And
he loves it.
The struggle for me is not getting the whole course online, which Bob would verify. I've done everything. They don't touch paper anymore. But I do have to do a lot of temperature taking. You call it dipsticking. In order to make sure that they are moving from that very concrete to the normal curve, which is very conceptual, to their clinical area, whatever that is in terms of research article. So I'm struggling with, especially for a more beginning learner, how I would accomplish that without the temperature taking that I do very, very consistently throughout the class period, and over time, abundantly, back and forth, which varies from fall to spring for me. I have older learners in the spring than I do in the fall, and so it's the unpopularity of it, it's the density of it, it's the, oh no, it's the connection of the narrative with the numbers that I struggle with. And I don't know if there's anything comparable in anybody's history. I see a little bit of you.
Can I ask a question that might feed into that a little bit, and then maybe your answers will speak to all of us? It seems to me that what you're all trying to do is you're trying to find ways to take these learning objectives that you've thought through. Some of them are written down in the syllabus, some of them are broader than that. You mentioned some things you're trying to do that are really kind of more meta-learning kinds of processes that probably aren't in the syllabus. And you're trying to find ways to get at them, whether you're standing in front of a class, whether you are online, whether you're in a hybrid environment, however that works. How do you, with regard to what you said, what Craig said, how do you think that through? How do you take the learning objectives that you have, and how do you process those in terms of the activities that you're going to create for the students? Do you tend to start personally more, I mean you guys specifically, do you tend to start personally more with the modalities you're comfortable with? Like, here are the techniques I'm comfortable with, let me find a way to work these into my learning objectives? Or do you really throw everything out on the lawn and say, I'm going to pick and choose from all the various possibilities out there to give my students the best possible experience, and this is not necessarily going to have anything to do with what I'm used to. I'm really looking for the best way to do this. Or is it something kind of in between there? How do you, what do you prefer to do?
For me, that's pretty easy to lay out for you. And not to give the wrong impression, I mean, actually my students love my classes, and as long as I'm in this lecturing format in a small department, it's going great. It's just if I have to start going online, it's like, that's going to change the dynamic radically. But the way I do that is that I actually begin with the material, which is the period of art we're going to learn. And I ask what's inherent to the experiencing of that. And then I structure the class accordingly. So, for example, when I'm teaching my post-World War II art history class, which is contemporary art, it's not been sorted by historians. It's still amongst us. These people are still walking around making it. Your experience of that is you walk into galleries and contemporary shows, and you can't pick up a book to read about it, so you've got to figure it out. It's very immediate. So I structure that class in a way that's very immediate. We start with me putting up images and saying, what are you getting? What are you seeing? Start talking, start analyzing, which then backs up into me then delivering a lecture on the movement that those artists are coming out of. If we're doing Renaissance art, you don't encounter it that way. So I tend to start with a lecture that lays the context and, and all of that, and then goes the other direction to where they can make some comments. So I pretty much, because I have this really profound respect for the artworks and being in their presence, and so I pretty much say, how are those encountered and processed by a viewer? And my presentation should basically be an analog of that.
In terms of your comment, Matt, perhaps it reflects my background in the computer industry, but I think of output first, and that is what behavior do I really look for, you might say, at the end of the course? What should they be able to do? How will they be different? What decisions will they make that are better or different? The one course that sort of challenges you on this is a course on leadership. You can talk all day and all night about leadership, which is a very theoretical. You can point to great characters in history, etc., and everybody in the class can say, well, yes, I agree with that. That's the way I should be. And in fact, I am that way. Well, they're not, but they want to think so. And So in thinking about that, after a couple of years of teaching that particular course, we found, in effect, a video that has a great deal of tension in it and excitement, and it's around World War II, so life and death is involved. And the students are absolutely gripped by it and can't leave it alone. Many of them say, well, I want to review it again and again. So we put it online and created a whole series of questions, etc., for them to analyze it and find in what they saw and identify the theory that we had been teaching so that they knew it. And repeatedly they would come back and say, Bob knows our problems of getting it online in time and so forth, so they could do it. But once we got that solved, they would show it to themselves over and over again because they kept missing something. And when you see it the first time, you grasp it at one level, and as you begin to see it again and again, you're seeing more there the second and third time than you did the first time. And now their dialogue and their ability to reflect in their writing is they did see what we wanted them to see, and they can comment on that. And in fact, they started taking count statistically of how many observations they could make. And of course, the good students made a much larger number of observations than the other students. And so I think you've got to start with the outcome. What behavior do you want to be different at the end? And then find the medium that allows you to get to that point, rather than starting with, this is the medium I like, and how can I make this fit?
And that's probably the connection, Matt, you were making with the question on statistics, is what's the outcome in any subject and what might work best to get us to that outcome. And there are multiple channels to do it. It sounds like the way you're doing it works quite well, actually, because it has that personal engagement that sometimes mathematics is hard to find. But that's the downside, if there is one, is I don't know all those instructional strategies. You know, I don't know the whole realm to pick from. That's where it's so nice to have mentors, coaches, people who dialogue with you about, well, I tried this. I woke up at 3 this morning thinking about something I was going to do with my class that I had never done. It's super simple, and it's being done in other classes, but it dawned on me at the moment at 3 in the morning, which was, I'm going to hold a draft day in every class. And the definition of draft day is wherever I call that draft day, I want to see the draft of whatever it is you're working on. So if it's a research paper or a problem-solving event or what it is, I want to see where you're at. And then you're going to do a 2+2. 2 things that are working well with that and 2 things you're still struggling with. And what I'll look at as a professor is I won't look at the draft. The draft is a way of sort of making sure we're in progress, that we're working towards something. It's part of a discipline, but at the same time, the 2+2 tells me what's going on with them. And then I can feedback to them, well, here's what I hear, and here's some resource you might want to look at, and here's another way to look at that problem, and I can be the, as the classic is, the guide on the side, instead of the sage on the stage, which is where lecture got a lot of its bad name, is when that quote came out in education. And the net effect is it helps me kind of keep up. So little things like that, however we're going about teaching, are kind of fun, because you can experiment with them and try different things. We really did, especially, you can imagine the middle school, put 30-some of you middle schoolers in front of me, and I've got to keep you engaged for 45 to 50 minutes. You better be on your game, you better know how to move things around, you better know how to read what's going on, you better know how to do a lot of those things. But we kind of give up some of that with adults. We sort of lay the whole responsibility on them, and we kind of do our thing and expect them that they're going to do it. So it's kind of that, let's have some fun with it, figure some things out, try some things and see what they do. But never forget, and I live by this, Manny Stiles, who's the gentleman who wrote Sperry Rand's Sperry Rand's product basically on staff development and decision making, all that kind of stuff. He's a really pretty sharp guy. He runs around with a white cuff shirt that has Mr. Listen on the cuff because he considers himself Mr. Listen. But his point always was, in any communication, be it a classroom, a single communication like a conversation, he uses a 51% rule. And this is where a lot of us, and I heard Wayne say some of this, really have struggled. 51% of the responsibility in a conversation lies on the listener. 49% on the speaker. And if that switches the other way around, you're out of the game. Because you can't make somebody listen. You can't make them do something. So as a teacher, if you think in the classroom, I'm doing 49% of this, but really 51% has to be coming back at me, because that's how learning happens. It doesn't happen by just sitting there passively and not engaging. So I like to think about that often. No matter what I do, what I choose to do is it putting the responsibility on the learner. And if they can't handle it, which a lot of kids coming in haven't been schooled that way, then it's our job to help them understand it. It's not our job to pick up the pieces and clean up the messes. We can walk them through that with the goal that they will be able to be more effective in doing that. And so I think of engagement in terms of how can I get that 51% for my students? How can I do that? How many ways can I find to get them there? And I can tell you, and I'll tell you about your classes because they're all the same. They're all normally distributed. You've got the ones that own 80% and you love them because they're just chewing it up. And you've got the ones sitting around 50 that flop back and forth any good day. I don't know what it is, the weather, the dreary weather or whatever. And then you've got the other end of the distribution where you're going, this one's not going to work, you know, because I'm doing everything for that student. And colleges sort out some of them a little bit because you get some of the different students, so it gets skewed a little bit one way or the other. But I just thought I'd share that because no matter what you do, have some fun with it, but at the same time ask yourself, am I shifting the responsibility where I want it to be on the learner? And is my technique, whatever it is, doing that? And so Matt's question is really, yeah, as many techniques you can get your hands on with the standard of helping the student learn, be their own learner in particular. That's kind of the fun of teaching, is to try to figure that out, the ways you can do it. End of lecture, sorry about that. It's one of my hot buttons.
I remember when I was in the Army, we had I learned something pretty important, I thought. We had to endure lectures in the afternoon, and they were a chore because you'd just eaten, you'd been active all morning, and the tendency was to fall asleep, obviously. And we had this one instructor who said, you know, I'm going to have to show you two movies this afternoon. He said, I understand the problem, I'll make a deal with you. He said, if you will watch the first one, I'll let you sleep through the second one. And he said, are you okay with that? And we said, yeah, cool, that's good. We're all for that one. He said, I appreciate what you're doing. And this was an officer, and I began to wonder, there's a game here somewhere. Well, the first one was as boring as you possibly could imagine. It was keeping shoe leather dry or something. Well, the second one was what happens if you don't. And it took you in, you talk about engaging students and causing them to listen. You wouldn't dare go asleep because in effect they were telling you your life is dependent on this. And he put the onus on us to listen. And because we had endured the first one, we had made the agreement, we couldn't go to sleep in the second one, no way. And so he got you. He got us. he got us to listen by the media that was so engaging that you couldn't elect an option not to listen to it. And I know with our adult learners, at least in the MBA program, they've worked all day. They're tired. They come and they've got to sit there from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock. You have got to sing, dance, and jump on top of the table or whatever.
Do you have that on the video? Are you up on top of it?
They cut that part out, unfortunately. And you've got to do those kinds of things. But what you're saying is absolutely right on. You've got to create, and I think that's where technology can help us, interesting interactions that cause them to own the experience rather than are dependent on it. The little thing I did on the video is the ability to make a judgment as to what they're seeing, and then immediately see how all their peers made that judgment. That's very interesting to them, is to say, well, how do I feel about this? I'm different than everybody else, I think. I wonder why that is. It causes them to pay attention.
I think we have to wrap up.
We do. We do. Thank you so much for some good things to think about. Let's give them a hand here. So